Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I rented a cabin deep in the woods to finish my novel. The idea was to be away from distractions, just me and my thoughts. It was secluded, the perfect place to focus. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings writing and my afternoons hiking. It was everything I had hoped for. On the fourth day, I started noticing things. Small things. My papers weren't where I left them. A chair was moved. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I found food in the fridge that I hadn't bought. It was strange, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just forgotten. One evening, I returned from a walk and found the door slightly ajar. My heart raced. I was sure I had locked it. I stepped inside cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was there. No response. I checked every room, but I was alone. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I heard noises outside. Footsteps, twigs snapping. I looked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I told myself it was just animals, but I couldn't sleep. I kept listening, every sound making me jump. In the morning, I found muddy footprints leading up to the door. Someone had been here. Panic set in. I wanted to leave, but I was miles from the nearest town and had no phone signal. I decided to stay alert and see if I could catch whoever was doing this. I spent the day trying to write, but my mind kept wandering. Every noise outside made me freeze. By evening, I was a wreck. I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the living room with a kitchen knife, waiting. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. They were closer this time, right outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I held my breath, listening. The doorknob rattled, and I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone was trying to get in. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. A man stood there, scruffy and unkempt, trying to pick the lock. Fear gripped me. I had to do something. I banged on the door and shouted, hoping to scare him off. He looked up, startled, and fled into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I decided I had to leave, but I didn't know how. My car was parked a mile down a rough trail, and I was afraid the man might be waiting for me. I packed a bag with essentials and decided to make a run for it. I stepped outside, clutching the knife, and started down the trail. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man behind me. I was about halfway to the car when I saw him, standing in the path ahead. He smiled, a chilling grin that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran back towards the cabin, my mind racing. I could hear him running after me, getting closer. I burst through the door and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. I was trapped. I looked around, desperate for a way out. There was a small window in the bathroom. I climbed through it and dropped to the ground, hoping he wouldn't see me. I crept around the cabin and started towards the car again, staying low and moving as quietly as I could. I made it to the car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I finally got the door open and jumped in, locking it behind me. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I drove until I reached a small town and found a police station. I told them everything. They sent officers to the cabin, but the man was gone. They found signs that someone had been living there, but no clues about who he was or why he was there. I never went back to that cabin. I decided to rent a cabin for a week-long hiking trip. Work had been stressful, and I needed a break. The cabin was secluded, about 10 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick woods. It was perfect for what I needed. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, unpacked my gear, and settled in. The first day, I spent exploring the area around the cabin, getting a feel for the trails. The air was fresh, the forest quiet except for the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The next morning, I set out early for a long hike. The trail was well marked, and I lost myself in the beauty of the forest. Around midday, I stopped by a stream to rest and eat. That's when I met him. He was an older man, maybe in his 50s, with a friendly smile and a slight limp. He introduced himself as Tom, a local who lived nearby. We talked for a while, and he told me about the area, giving me tips on the best trails and spots to visit. He seemed genuinely nice, and I was glad to have met someone out here. After a while, we parted ways, and I continued my hike. Over the next couple of days, I saw Tom a few more times. He would show up unexpectedly on the trails, always with that same friendly smile. We chatted briefly each time, and I started to look forward to our encounters. He felt like a connection to the outside world in this remote place. But on the fourth day, things changed. I was hiking a different trail when I saw Tom again. This time, his smile seemed forced, and there was a strange look in his eyes. He asked me where I was heading, and when I told him, he insisted on showing me a better route. I hesitated, but I didn't want to be rude, so I followed him. As we walked, the trail became less and less defined. The trees grew thicker, and I realized we were heading deeper into the woods, away from the marked paths. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Something was off. I told Tom I wanted to head back, but he just smiled and said we were almost there. Suddenly, he stopped and turned to face me. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard expression. He told me he needed my help, that he had been hiding in these woods for years, and that he couldn't let me leave. Panic set in. I realized I was alone in the woods with a man who was not what he seemed. I tried to reason with him, but his eyes were wild. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me off the trail. I fought back, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I managed to break free and started running, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear him behind me, shouting, but I didn't look back. I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between us as possible. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I kept running. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin. I ran inside and slammed the door shut, looking for something to barricade it. The place was filled with old furniture and debris. I shoved a heavy table against the door and looked for a weapon. I found a rusted metal rod and gripped it tightly, my hand shaking. I could hear Tom outside, his footsteps crunching on the forest floor. He circled the cabin, trying to find a way in. I stayed silent, trying to control my breathing. I heard him testing the windows, then the back door. Each time, I braced myself, ready to fight. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the noises stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was only silence. I stayed in the cabin until the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls. Only then did I dare to move. I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, and there was no sign of Tom. I made my way back to my rented cabin as quickly and quietly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got back, I packed my things and drove straight to the nearest town. I went to the police and told them everything. They listened, but I could tell they thought I was just some paranoid city guy who had gotten spooked in the woods. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They had found signs that someone had been living in the woods near where I had been hiking. They never caught Tom, and I never went back to that cabin. The experience left me shaken, but I was grateful to be alive. I finished my hiking trip with friends after that, never alone. The cabin we rented was perfect, nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. Laura and I had been looking forward to this getaway for months. The first day, we settled in, unpacked, and explored the area. The place had a rustic charm, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace. It felt cozy and safe. The second day, we decided to relax. Laura cooked breakfast while I read by the fire. After eating, we took a hike along the nearby trail. Everything was going great until we got back to the cabin that afternoon. I noticed something odd when I went to plug in my phone charger behind the TV. There was a small, blinking light. I moved the TV and found a tiny camera hidden there. I called Laura over, and we both felt a chill. We started searching the cabin and found more cameras, one in the bedroom, one in the bathroom, and another in the living room. They were well hidden, but now that we knew what to look for, they were easy to spot. Someone had been watching us the whole time. Our first thought was to leave immediately, but the cabin was miles from the nearest town, and it was getting dark. Laura suggested we call the police, but there was no cell reception. We felt trapped. We decided to pack our things and drive to the nearest place with a signal. As we were gathering our stuff, there was a knock on the door. My heart stopped. We hadn't seen anyone else since we arrived. I opened the door a crack, and there was a man standing there, middle-aged, with a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as the owner of the cabin. He said he was just checking in to see if we needed anything. His presence felt wrong, especially after finding the cameras. Laura stood behind me, clutching her phone. I told him everything was fine and that we were just about to leave. His smile faded, and his eyes grew cold. He stepped inside, uninvited, and closed the door behind him. He said we couldn't leave, not yet. He started talking about how the cameras were for our safety, how he needed to monitor the property. His tone was calm, but there was something menacing underneath. Laura and I exchanged a glance. We both knew we had to get out. I tried to keep him talking while Laura edged towards the back door. She opened it slowly, trying not to make a sound. But he noticed. He lunged at her, and I tackled him. We struggled on the floor, knocking over a table. Laura screamed and ran outside. I managed to get free and followed her. We sprinted to the car and jumped in. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The owner was running after us, yelling. I finally got the engine started, and we tore down the dirt road, kicking up dust. We drove until we reached a small gas station with a payphone. Laura called the police while I kept watch. We were both on edge, expecting him to show up any minute. The police arrived and took our statements. They said they would investigate and told us to find somewhere else to stay for the night. We drove to the nearest town and checked into a hotel. Neither of us slept much. The next day, the police called to say they found more cameras in the cabin, but the owner had disappeared. They promised to keep looking for him, but it didn't make us feel any safer. I decided to rent a remote cabin for the weekend to get away from everything. Work was overwhelming, and I needed some quiet time. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect, isolated, peaceful, surrounded by nature. The first day was great. I spent the morning reading by the fireplace and the afternoon exploring the trails nearby. On the second night, I was woken up by a noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard voices. My heart started pounding. I got out of bed and crept to the window. Outside, I saw 3 men, dressed in dark clothes, moving towards the cabin. They had flashlights and were talking quietly. Panic set in. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I had to think fast. The cabin had a back door that led into the woods. I decided to sneak out and hide until they left. I grabbed my jacket and shoes, quietly unlocking the back door. As I stepped outside, I heard the front door being kicked in. I ran into the trees, not looking back. The woods were dark and cold, but I knew I had to keep moving. I could hear the men inside the cabin, yelling and searching. I found a spot behind a thick cluster of bushes and crouched down, trying to control my breathing. I listened as the men tore through the cabin, breaking things and shouting. It sounded like they were looking for something specific. After what felt like forever, I heard them leave the cabin. I stayed hidden, too scared to move. Minutes passed, and then I heard footsteps again, this time coming towards me. They must have realized I had escaped. I had to move. I got up and started running deeper into the woods. I knew the area well from my hikes, and I hoped that would give me an advantage. I could hear them behind me, their voices getting closer. I tried to stay off the main trails, moving through the underbrush to avoid being seen. My heart was racing, and my breath was coming in short gasps. I tripped over a root and fell, scraping my hands and knees. I bit back a cry of pain and got up, forcing myself to keep going. I reached a rocky outcrop that I remembered from my hikes. There was a small cave underneath it, barely big enough for me to squeeze into. I crawled inside, hoping they wouldn't find me. I could hear them searching the area, their flashlights sweeping through the trees. They were getting closer. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look in the cave. One of them stopped right in front of it, his flashlight being just inches from my hiding spot. He called out to the others, saying he thought he heard something. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding in my ears. After a few tense moments, they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I waited, not daring to move, until I was sure they were gone. When I finally crawled out of the cave, it was nearly dawn. My body ached from the cold and the fear, but I knew I had to keep going. I made my way back to the cabin, staying off the trails and moving as quietly as I could. When I got there, the place was a wreck. The front door was hanging off its hinges, and the inside was trashed. I grabbed my bag and my keys, thankful they hadn't taken my car. I drove to the nearest town and went straight to the police. They took my statement and sent officers to the cabin, but the men were long gone. They said it looked like a case of mistaken identity, that the men were likely looking for something or someone else. The experience left me shaken, but I was grateful to be alive. I decided to cut my trip short and go back home, needing the comfort of familiar surroundings. We were just looking for a quiet weekend away. My friends and I rented a cabin in the woods. There were 4 of us, me, Steve, my buddy Mike, his girlfriend Jen, and our friend Lisa. The cabin was perfect, secluded, peaceful, surrounded by trees. The first day went by great. We grilled, hiked a bit, played some games. It was supposed to be a relaxing break from the city. On the second night, we were sitting around the fire pit, talking and laughing, when we heard a noise in the distance. It sounded like branches snapping. We stopped talking and listened, but then it was quiet again. We shrugged it off, thinking it was an animal. About an hour later, we decided to head inside. As we were packing up the last of our things, I heard footsteps, heavy and fast, coming from the woods. Before I could react, 3 men burst into the clearing. They were all wearing dark clothes and masks, and they had guns. "Get inside," one of them yelled, pointing his gun at us. We didn't have a choice. We did as we were told. Once inside, they made us sit on the floor in the living room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. One of the men, who seemed to be the leader, started asking us questions. "Is there anyone else here? Any phones or weapons?" We shook our heads, too scared to speak. They searched the cabin, taking our phones and tossing them in a bag. They were arguing amongst themselves. I caught bits and pieces, something about a job gone wrong, needing a place to lay low. We realized we were just unlucky. They needed a place to hide, and we happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The leader turned to us again. "We're not here to hurt you, but if you try anything, we won't hesitate," he said. His voice was cold, almost mechanical. "We're staying here until it's safe to leave. Do as we say, and you'll be fine." We nodded, fear gripping us. They set up a watch, one of them always keeping an eye on us while the others rested. We were crammed into the corner of the living room, whispering to each other when we could. We needed a plan, but we had no idea how to escape. Hours passed, and we could see the men getting restless. They argued more, the tension between them growing. This was our chance. We needed to work together. Mike whispered that he had seen a window in the back room that was slightly open. If we could create a distraction, maybe one of us could slip out and get help. I volunteered. We waited until the guy on watch seemed distracted. Jen started to cry, loudly, which drew his attention. I took the opportunity and crawled toward the back room. My heart was pounding, but I kept going. I reached the window and slowly pushed it open. It made a slight creak and I froze, but no one came. I slipped out into the night, the cold air hitting my face. I crept around the side of the cabin, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Suddenly, I heard a shout from inside. They had realized I was gone. I had to move fast. I ran through the woods, branches scratching my face and arms. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away as possible and find help. After what felt like forever, I saw lights through the trees. I stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man, saw the panic on my face and stopped. I quickly explained what happened, and he called the police. It felt like an eternity, but finally, the police arrived. They moved quickly, surrounding the cabin. There was a standoff, and we heard gunshots. My heart sank, fearing the worst for my friends. But then, it was over. The police emerged with the 3 men in custody. I ran to the cabin, and relief washed over me when I saw Mike, Jen, and Lisa safe. We hugged, tears streaming down our faces. The police took our statements and assured us the men would be going away for a long time. That weekend changed us. We were just a group of friends looking for a quiet getaway, but we ended up in a nightmare. I rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere to get away from everything. Being in the public, I was exhausting. I needed peace, some time to myself. The cabin was perfect, isolated, surrounded by trees, and far from the nearest town. I felt like I could finally breathe. The first day was wonderful. I spent the morning on the porch with my coffee, listening to the birds. In the afternoon, I went for a long hike and took some photos of the beautiful scenery. By evening, I was feeling more relaxed than I had in months. On the second day, I was sitting outside, reading a book, when I noticed someone coming up the path. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s, carrying a small bag. He seemed out of place, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was a hiker who got lost. I put down my book and stood up to greet him. "Hi there," he said with a smile. "Sorry to bother you, but I got turned around on the trails. Do you have any water?" I hesitated but then nodded. "Sure, come on up. I've got some bottles inside." He followed me up to the porch, and I handed him a bottle of water from the cooler. As he drank, he started talking. "You're Linda, right? I'm a big fan of your work." My heart sank. I came out here to get away from fans and the constant attention. But he seemed harmless enough, so I forced a smile. "Thanks. I appreciate it." We chatted for a bit, and he seemed normal. He told me his name was Eric, and he was on a hiking trip. After a while, he thanked me for the water and left. I felt uneasy, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just a coincidence. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept hearing noises outside, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the woods and my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found a note on my porch. "Thanks for the water. See you soon. Eric." My heart raced. How did he find me out here? I decided it was time to cut my trip short. I packed my things and loaded them into my car, but when I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic set in. I was stranded. I went back inside and locked the doors, trying to come up with a plan. I had no phone signal out here, and the nearest town was miles away. I decided to stay put and wait until morning. Maybe I could flag down a passing car on the main road. As night fell, I heard footsteps outside. I peered through the window and saw Eric standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching the cabin. My blood ran cold. I stayed hidden, praying he would go away. Hours passed, and I thought maybe he had left. But then I heard a knock at the door. "Linda, I know you're in there. I just want to talk." His voice was calm, almost too calm. I didn't respond. I backed away from the door and grabbed a kitchen knife. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The door handle rattled, but the lock held. "I don't want to hurt you, Linda. I just want to be close to you," he said, his voice now pleading. I stayed silent, hoping he would give up. But then I heard a crash. He had broken a window and was climbing in. I ran to the bathroom and locked myself inside, my hands shaking. For what felt like hours, I listened to him moving around the cabin, searching for me. He was talking to himself, muttering about how we were meant to be together. I clutched the knife, ready to defend myself if he found me. Finally, the noise stopped. I waited, not daring to move. When dawn broke, I cautiously opened the bathroom door. The cabin was empty, but trashed. He had left, but I knew he could come back. I took a deep breath and decided to make a run for it. I left the cabin and headed towards the main road, staying off the trails to avoid being seen. After what felt like hours, I reached the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They went to the cabin, but Eric was gone. They said they'd keep an eye out for him, but I knew it wasn't over. We hadn't seen each other in years, so when Kevin suggested a reunion at a cabin in the woods, we all jumped at the chance. It was me, Jake, along with Kevin, Dan, and Tom. We used to be inseparable in college, but life happened and we drifted apart. The idea of reconnecting sounded perfect. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, set deep in the forest. It had a large porch, a fire pit, and enough space for us all to relax. The first night, we laughed and reminisced, sharing stories and drinking a bit too much. Everything felt like old times, at least at first. The second day, we went for a hike. The forest was dense, and the trails were barely marked, but Kevin seemed to know where he was going. He said he'd been here before. We followed him, trusting his lead. It was fun, tiring but good to be out in nature. That evening, around the fire, the mood shifted. Kevin brought up an old argument between Tom and Dan from years ago. It was stupid stuff about a girl they both liked, but the tension was palpable. Dan brushed it off, but Tom seemed irritated. Kevin kept pushing, making snide comments and bringing up more old dirt. I tried to change the subject, but the atmosphere had already soured. As the night wore on, Kevin's behavior got stranger. He started talking about how we had all changed, how some of us weren't true friends anymore. It was unsettling. At one point, he mentioned something about payback and how we would all understand soon. I laughed nervously, hoping it was just the alcohol talking. I decided to go to bed early, feeling uneasy. I heard the others talking quietly, voices low and serious. Sleep didn't come easily, and I kept waking up, feeling like something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my window. I peeked out but saw nothing in the darkness. A loud crash woke me fully. I grabbed my flashlight and went to see what happened. In the living room, I found Dan and Tom arguing with Kevin. Kevin had knocked over a table, and he was shouting about betrayal and lies. His eyes were wild, and there was something in his hand, a knife. "Kevin, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at me. Kevin's face twisted into a sinister smile. "Just setting things right," he said, his voice cold. "You all need to understand what you've done." He lunged at Tom, but Dan tackled him to the ground. The knife skidded across the floor. I grabbed it and threw it into the fireplace. Kevin struggled, shouting incoherently about justice and revenge. It took all three of us to restrain him. We managed to tie him up with some rope we found in the cabin shed. He kept yelling, cursing us, and saying we'd regret this. We were all shaken, trying to figure out what to do next. There was no phone signal out here, and the nearest town was miles away. Tom and Dan stayed with Kevin while I tried to sleep again, but it was impossible. Every sound made me jump, and I kept thinking about Kevin's words. What had we done to him? What was he talking about? In the morning, we decided to hike back to the car and get help. Kevin had calmed down but still glared at us with hatred. We left him tied up, promising to return with the police. The hike felt like it took forever, and the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. When we finally reached the car, we drove to the nearest town and called the police. They took our statement and went to the cabin. We followed, hearts pounding. When we arrived, the cabin was quiet. The police went in and found Kevin still tied up, but he had managed to loosen the ropes. He was taken into custody, ranting about how we had ruined his life. It turns out Kevin had been harboring grudges for years, blaming us for his failures and setbacks. He had planned this weekend as a way to confront us and make us pay. We were lucky to get out unharmed, but the experience left a mark on all of us. Our reunion was supposed to bring us closer, but instead, it exposed the dark side of our past. We all went our separate ways after that. The bond we once had was shattered, replaced by a lingering sense of fear and mistrust. I still think about that weekend sometimes, wondering how things could have been different. I decided to take a break from everything and rented a small cabin in the woods for a week. The place was isolated, surrounded by tall trees, and miles away from the nearest town. It was perfect for some peace and quiet, a chance to clear my head. The first couple of days were blissful. I spent my time reading, walking in the forest, and just enjoying the silence. On the third day, as I was making lunch, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked over and opened the door to find a man standing there. He looked to be in his mid-40s, with scruffy hair and a worn-out jacket. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and a tired expression on his face. "Hi, sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm lost. My car broke down a few miles back, and my phone's dead. Could I use yours to call for help?" I hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Sure, come in. The phone is inside." I stepped aside, and he walked in, looking around the cabin with curious eyes. He picked up the phone, but after a few seconds, he put it back down. "No signal," he said, shaking his head. I was afraid of that. "Do you mind if I wait here for a bit, just until I figure out what to do?" Something felt off, but I didn't want to be rude. "I guess that's okay. I was just about to make some lunch. You can join me if you'd like." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That sounds great. Thank you." I went back to the kitchen, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. As I prepared the food, I could feel his eyes on me. It made my skin crawl, but I tried to ignore it. When I brought the plates to the table, he was sitting there, watching me intently. "So, what brings you out here?" he asked, taking a bite of his sandwich. "I needed a break from work, from everything," I replied, forcing a smile. "What about you? Where were you headed?" "Oh, just passing through," he said vaguely. "Looking for a fresh start." We ate in silence after that. When we finished, I stood up to clear the plates, but he grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong, and it hurt. "Thank you for the meal," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're welcome," I said, trying to pull my hand away. He let go, and I quickly backed away, my heart pounding. He got up and started walking around the cabin, touching things, picking up items, and examining them. "This is a nice place. Quiet. Perfect for getting away from it all." I nodded, keeping my distance. "Yes, it is. Look, if you want, I can drive you to the nearest town. It's not too far." He turned to me, a strange smile on his face. "No, that won't be necessary. I think I'll stay here for a while." My stomach dropped. "You can't stay here," I said, my voice trembling. "This is my place." He stepped closer, his eyes cold. "I don't think you understand. I'm staying. And you're going to make sure no one knows I'm here." I backed up until I hit the wall. Please, just leave. I won't tell anyone you were here, I promise. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Oh, I'm sure you won't. But I'm not going anywhere. Now, why don't you sit down and relax? I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. He was between me and the door, and I had no idea if I could make it to the car before he caught me. For the rest of the day, he stayed close, watching me, making sure I didn't try anything. As night fell, the tension grew unbearable. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. When he finally went to the bathroom, I saw my chance. I grabbed my car keys and slipped out the door as quietly as I could. I ran to the car, my heart pounding in my ears. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking, but I managed to get the door open and jumped in. Just as I started the engine, he burst out of the cabin, shouting and running towards me. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the gravel before the car shot forward. I didn't look back, my only thought was to get away. I drove straight to the nearest town and went to the police. They listened to my story and sent officers to the cabin, but by the time they got there, he was gone. They found signs that someone had been living in the woods nearby, but he had disappeared without a trace. I rented a cabin in the woods to get away from everything after my breakup with Derek. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, just me and my thoughts. The cabin was cozy, with a small porch overlooking a serene lake. I spent my days hiking and my evenings reading by the fireplace. It was perfect until Derek showed up. It was my third day there when I first saw him. I had just returned from a hike and saw his car parked next to mine. My heart sank. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, so how did he find me? I approached the cabin cautiously, and there he was, sitting on the porch, looking like he belonged there. "Emily," he said, standing up as I walked closer. "I needed to see you. We need to talk." I froze, unsure of what to do. "How did you find me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I have my ways. Can we go inside and talk?" I didn't want to let him in, but I didn't know what else to do. I nodded and opened the door, stepping aside to let him in. He walked in and looked around, taking in the small living room and kitchen. "You've got a nice setup here," he said, sitting down on the couch. I stayed by the door, ready to run if I had to. "Why are you here, Derek?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking a lot about us. I made a mistake, Emily. I want you back." I shook my head. "It's over, Derek. You need to leave." His face hardened. "I'm not leaving until we've talked this through." I could see the anger in his eyes, the same anger that had scared me so many times before. "There's nothing to talk about. Please, just go." He stood up, his movements jerky and aggressive. "I came all this way, Emily. The least you can do is hear me out." I backed up, my hand on the doorknob. "Fine. Talk." He started pacing, his voice rising as he spoke. "You never gave us a real chance. You just walked away when things got tough. That's not how relationships work." I could feel my fear turning into anger. "I walked away because you were hurting me, Derek. You can't just show up here and expect everything to be okay." He stopped pacing and stared at me. "I'm not leaving until we've sorted this out." I knew I had to get out of there. I opened the door and stepped outside, hoping he would follow me so I could run to my car. He followed, but instead of stopping at the porch, he grabbed my arm and pulled me back inside. "You're not running away this time," he said, his grip tight on my arm. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. "Let go of me, Derek." He shoved me onto the couch and stood over me, his face twisted with rage. "You're not leaving until I say you can." I knew I had to stay calm. I took a deep breath and looked up at him. "Okay. We'll talk. Just let me get a glass of water." He narrowed his eyes but stepped back, giving me enough space to stand up. I walked to the kitchen, my mind racing. There was a back door in the kitchen, but I didn't know if I could make it out before he caught me. I filled a glass with water, my hands shaking. "Do you want some?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head, watching me closely. "No. Just come back here and sit down." I took a sip of water and nodded. "Okay, just give me a second." I set the glass down and made a dash for the back door. I heard him shout and felt his hand brush my arm, but I was quicker. I threw the door open and ran outside, not looking back. I ran through the woods, my breath coming in short gasps. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I had to find a place to hide, to get away from him. I spotted a large tree with thick roots and ducked behind it, trying to quiet my breathing. I heard him pass by, cursing under his breath. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I started moving again, keeping low and quiet. I made my way back to the cabin, hoping he wouldn't think to check there. I grabbed my phone from the table and called 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. 911, what's your emergency? My ex-boyfriend found me. He's trying to hurt me. Please, send help, I whispered, my voice trembling. The operator assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay on the line. I locked myself in the bathroom, holding the phone tightly, listening for any sounds of Derek coming back. It felt like hours before I heard sirens in the distance. I stayed hidden until I heard a knock on the door and a voice calling my name. "Emily, it's the police. You're safe now." I opened the door and ran into the arms of the officer, relief washing over me. Derek was nowhere to be seen, but they assured me they would find him. They took me to the police station and I gave my statement. They promised to keep me updated on the search for Derek. I left the cabin that night and never went back. I moved to the cabin to focus on my art, thinking the peace and quiet would help me find inspiration. It was a small place, nestled deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city. The first few days were perfect. I painted from dawn until dusk, losing myself in the colors and shapes. I didn't miss the constant buzz of people and cars. One evening, as I was cleaning my brushes, I noticed something strange. A shadow moved outside my window. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept the curtains closed, but every little noise made my heart race. The next day, I went into town for supplies. The small grocery store was a welcome change from the solitude. As I loaded my car, I saw a man standing across the street, staring at me. He was average looking, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I tried to ignore him, but when I got back to the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about him. That night, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept to the window. I saw a figure moving around the side of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the knife, but the figure never came back. The next day, I found footprints around the cabin. They were fresh, leading from the woods to my front door and then back again. I realized whoever it was had been watching me for a while. Panic set in. I considered going back to the city, but I didn't want to let fear drive me away from my work. I decided to be more cautious. I kept my phone with me at all times and started locking the doors and windows. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I saw the man again when I went to town, and this time, he followed me. I drove around aimlessly for a while, trying to lose him, but when I got back to the cabin, I found a note on my door. It read, "I'm always watching." I called the police, but they were of little help. The officer I spoke to took down my information and promised to send someone to check on me, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. Days passed, and the sense of dread grew stronger. The man became bolder. I would find things moved around inside the cabin, even though I knew I hadn't touched them. My art supplies were often misplaced, and I found muddy footprints on the floor. One night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of my bed. I screamed, and he ran out of the cabin before I could react. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. They told me to stay with a friend or family, but I had no one nearby. I felt trapped and helpless. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up traps around the cabin, using whatever I could find. I put broken glass under the windows and placed noisy objects by the doors. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with my knife, waiting. Around midnight, I heard a crash. One of my traps had worked. I crept to the window and saw the man cursing as he tried to pull a piece of glass from his foot. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my situation to the operator. Then, I went outside, keeping to the shadows. I watched him from a distance, trying to stay calm. He limped toward the woods, and I followed, staying far enough back that he wouldn't notice me. When he disappeared into the trees, I ran back to the cabin and locked myself inside, waiting for the police to arrive. They found him an hour later, hiding in a makeshift camp not far from the cabin. He had been living there for weeks, watching me, planning. They arrested him, and I finally felt a sense of relief. I left the cabin the next day. The peace and quiet I had once loved now felt suffocating and dangerous. I returned to the city, where I felt safer among the crowds and noise. I still paint, but the experience changed me. I'm always looking over my shoulder, always on edge. It's hard to believe that someone could become so obsessed, but it happened to me. I survived, but I'll never forget the fear of being hunted, the terror of knowing someone was always watching. I used to work in law enforcement, but after a rough incident, I decided to leave that life behind and settle down in a quiet town. I thought I had left danger behind me, but sometimes trouble finds you when you least expect it. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon when it happened. I was walking home from the grocery store, thinking about what to cook for dinner, when I noticed a man lurking in the shadows. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his jacket and constantly scanning the street. I tried to ignore him, but something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. As I turned the corner onto my street, I felt a hand clamp down on my shoulder. Before I could react, the man spun me around and pressed something cold and metallic against my side. It was a gun. My heart pounded in my chest as he whispered, "Don't make a sound. Walk." He marched me down the street, away from the safety of my home. I tried to stay calm, my mind racing for a way out. I knew from my training that panicking would only make things worse. The man kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. We ended up in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was dark and musty, filled with echoes of its industrial past. The man pushed me into a corner and kept the gun trained on me, his eyes wild and desperate. He demanded to know who I was and what I did. I told him I was nobody, just a regular guy trying to live a quiet life. But he didn't believe me. He knew I used to be a cop, and he thought I could help him. He was on the run from something big, something dangerous. He needed a way out, and he saw me as his ticket. I tried to reason with him, to convince him that I couldn't help him, but he wouldn't listen. He kept pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I knew I had to do something before things got out of hand. I waited for the right moment, watching for any opportunity to turn the tables. Hours passed, and the tension in the warehouse grew thicker. The man grew more agitated, his grip on the gun tightening. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. When he turned his back to me, distracted by a noise outside, I lunged forward. I knocked the gun out of his hand and wrestled him to the ground. We fought hard, rolling on the dusty floor, each of us desperate to gain the upper hand. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I grappled with him, using every ounce of strength and skill I had. Finally, I managed to pin him down and secure his hands with a piece of rope I found nearby. I called the police on my cell phone, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. They arrived quickly, their guns drawn as they entered the warehouse. They took the man into custody without incident, and I finally allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. After everything was sorted out, the police thanked me for my cooperation and assured me that the man would be facing serious charges. They told me I had handled the situation well, considering the circumstances. But deep down, I knew how close I had come to losing everything. I returned home shaken but grateful to be alive. The incident reminded me of the dangers that lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life. It was a stark reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard you try to escape your past, it can come back to haunt you in unexpected ways. I took some time off work to recover from the ordeal, surrounded by the comfort of my home and the support of my friends and family. I knew I would never forget the fear and adrenaline of that day, but I also knew that I had survived, stronger than ever. Life eventually returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a second chance. I vowed to never take my safety for granted again, to always be vigilant and prepared for whatever might come my way. And as time passed, I slowly regained my sense of peace and security. But I knew that no matter how far I ran or how hard I tried to forget, the memory of that day would always be with me. I never thought renting a cabin for a peaceful getaway would turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a chance to unwind, away from the stress and drama that had been tearing our family apart. But things took a sinister turn when he found us. He was our cousin, Jack. We hadn't seen him in years, not since that big falling out over money and property. I remember the tension in the air whenever his name came up in family conversations. He was bitter, holding on to grudges from the past like they were his lifeline. The cabin seemed perfect at first, a quaint retreat nestled in the woods, far from the chaos of city life. We settled in, hoping the fresh air and change of scenery would heal old wounds. But on the second night, things took a chilling turn. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside our cabin. At first, I dismissed it as an animal or a neighbor taking a late-night stroll. But when the footsteps drew closer, I knew something wasn't right. I glanced out the window and saw a figure lurking in the shadows, watching our cabin with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I woke my husband, Mark, quietly, trying not to alert whoever was outside. We listened together as the footsteps paced back and forth, growing louder with each pass. Mark grabbed a flashlight and cautiously peered outside, but whoever it was had vanished into the darkness. We tried to reassure ourselves that it was just our imagination, maybe a curious hiker or a lost camper. But deep down, we knew it was more than that. The next morning, we found signs that someone had been prowling around our cabin, footprints in the mud, broken twigs, and even a torn piece of fabric caught on a bush. That evening, as we gathered around the dinner table, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat as Mark went to answer it. Standing on the porch was Jack, his face twisted with anger and resentment. He demanded to be let in, shouting accusations and threats. We tried to reason with him, to explain that we just wanted peace and didn't want any trouble. But Jack wasn't interested in listening. He pushed his way into the cabin, his eyes blazing with fury. He accused us of betraying him, of stealing what was rightfully his. I pleaded with him to calm down, to talk things through like adults. But Jack was beyond reason. He pulled out a knife, a gleaming blade that glinted in the dim light of the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized just how dangerous the situation had become. Mark stepped between us, trying to protect me and our children. Jack circled us like a predator, his voice low and menacing. He said he was going to make us pay for what we did, that we couldn't escape the consequences of our actions. I glanced at the window, calculating our chances of escape. But Jack was blocking the door, his eyes never leaving us. We were trapped, at his mercy. I knew we had to do something, anything, to survive. In a desperate move, Mark lunged at Jack, knocking the knife from his hand. They wrestled on the floor, crashing into furniture and sending dishes flying. I grabbed the children and rushed towards the door, shouting for them to run as fast as they could into the woods. Outside, the night air was cold and still. I could hear the sounds of struggle coming from inside the cabin, mixed with Jack's enraged shouts. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to shield the children from the horrors unfolding behind us. We ran for what felt like hours, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, we stumbled upon a clearing where we collapsed, exhausted and terrified. I held my children close, praying that Mark would find a way to escape, that we would all make it out of this nightmare alive. Minutes turned into hours as we waited in the darkness, listening for any sign of pursuit. But there was only silence. Eventually, we heard the distant sound of sirens approaching, the cavalry arriving to rescue us from the hell we had endured. The police found Jack in the cabin, subdued and handcuffed. Mark had managed to overpower him and hold him until help arrived. They took Jack away, his protests echoing in the night air. I watched from a distance, numb with shock and relief. In the days that followed, we pieced together what had happened. Jack had been harboring resentment for years, blaming us for his misfortunes and failures. He had followed us to the cabin, consumed by a need for revenge that had spiraled out of control. We moved back home, grateful to be reunited but forever changed by what had happened. The scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But we were alive, and that was all that mattered. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of my mind, the fear that one day, Jack might come back. But we took precautions, installing security measures and keeping in close contact with the police. Life slowly returned to normal, but I knew we would never forget the terror of those nights in the cabin. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance for Tom and Nancy to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. We found a cozy cabin nestled in the mountains, far from the noise and stress of our daily routines. The crisp air and the scent of pine trees welcomed us as we unpacked and settled in for what we hoped would be a peaceful vacation. The first few days were perfect. We hiked during the day, explored nearby trails, and cooked hearty meals in the evenings. We felt a sense of tranquility we hadn't experienced in years. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch falling, but then I heard voices, muffled whispers coming from downstairs. My heart raced as I shook Nancy awake, whispering urgently that someone was in the cabin. We listened in terror as footsteps approached our bedroom door. The doorknob rattled, and my pulse quickened. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the nightstand, ready to defend ourselves if necessary. The door swung open, and two masked men burst into the room, their faces hidden behind bandanas. They were armed, holding guns that glinted in the moonlight streaming through the window. One of them demanded to know where we kept our valuables, threatening us with the gun. Nancy and I froze, fear gripping us as we realized the severity of the situation. I stammered, trying to explain that we didn't have anything valuable, that we were just here for a vacation. But the men didn't believe us. They tore through our belongings, tossing clothes and personal items aside in search of hidden treasures. They grew increasingly agitated, convinced that we were holding out on them. One of the men grabbed Nancy roughly, demanding that she tell them where the money was. I could see the fear in her eyes as she shook her head, insisting that we didn't have any money or jewels. The man pressed the gun to her temple, his voice low and threatening. I knew we had to do something, anything, to survive. Adrenaline surged through me as I thought of a way to distract them. I told them about a safe in the basement, a lie, hoping to buy us some time. They hesitated for a moment, then ordered us downstairs at gunpoint, warning that if they didn't find anything valuable, they would kill us. As we descended the stairs, I racked my brain for a plan. We couldn't outrun them, couldn't overpower them with just the two of us. We had to outsmart them somehow, catch them off guard. In the basement, they continued their frantic search, overturning furniture and tearing open cabinets. I saw my chance when one of the men turned his back to us, engrossed in rifling through a drawer. I signaled to Nancy subtly, and we moved silently towards the door leading to the backyard. I knew it was risky, but it was our only chance to escape. We slipped outside into the cool night air, the adrenaline pumping through our veins. I could hear the men shouting behind us, realizing we had tricked them. We ran blindly through the darkness, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over rocks. I could hear the men crashing through the back door of the cabin, their shouts growing louder as they realized we were gone. We didn't dare look back, didn't stop running until we reached the main road where our car was parked. Nancy fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she unlocked the doors. We jumped inside and sped away, the headlights cutting through the night as we drove frantically towards the nearest town. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. We were safe, but the terror of that night would haunt us forever. We drove straight to the police station, our voices trembling as we recounted what had happened. They took our statements, reassuring us that they would do everything in their power to catch the men responsible. But even as we spoke to the police, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of the lingering fear that they might come back for us. The police investigated the cabin, finding evidence of forced entry and searching for any clues that might lead to the robbers. They assured us they would increase patrols in the area, but I knew deep down that we would never feel completely safe again. In the weeks that followed, we installed security cameras at our home, changed our locks, and took self-defense classes. The trauma of that night lingered, casting a shadow over our once peaceful lives. We tried to move on, to reclaim our sense of security, but the memory of those masked men would always be with us. We never returned to that cabin in the mountains, choosing instead to find solace in different places, far from the memories of that terrifying night. I was driving through a remote stretch of highway, the rain hammering down on my windshield like an angry drum. The wipers struggled to keep up, squeaking and stuttering as they cleared the water. It was getting late, and visibility was poor. I cursed myself for not checking the weather forecast before setting out on this road trip. Up ahead, I saw a figure walking along the shoulder of the road, hunched against the rain. I slowed down as I approached, my headlights casting a weak glow on the person. He was dressed in ragged clothes, his hair matted and unkempt. He looked up as I passed, and I caught a glimpse of his face, weather-beaten and weary. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the radio dial. I knew it wasn't safe to pick up hitchhikers, especially in weather like this. But something about the man's appearance tugged at my conscience. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him disappearing into the darkness behind me. Guilt gnawed at me as I drove on, the rain drumming relentlessly on the roof of my car. Finally, I couldn't ignore the feeling of unease that settled in my gut. I made a U-turn at the next opportunity, my headlights sweeping over the road in search of the man. I found him a few miles down the highway, trudging along with his head down against the rain. I pulled up beside him and rolled down the passenger window. He looked surprised but grateful as he approached the car. "Hey, need a ride?" I called out over the roar of the rain. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded gratefully and climbed into the passenger seat. The smell of wet earth and stale sweat filled the car as he settled in beside me. He introduced himself as Mike, a drifter passing through the area. His voice was rough, tinged with a hint of desperation. We made small talk as I drove, navigating the slick roads with caution. Mike told me he had been walking for miles, trying to find shelter from the storm. He seemed harmless enough, grateful for the ride and eager to find a warm place to dry off. I felt a pang of guilt as we passed a motel on the outskirts of town. I knew I couldn't just leave Mike out in the storm, so I made a split-second decision to invite him to stay the night at my cabin. It was secluded, nestled in the woods away from prying eyes. I assured myself it was the right thing to do, a gesture of kindness in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. As we pulled up to the cabin, I could see the relief on Mike's face. He thanked me profusely as we hurried inside, escaping the relentless downpour. I built a fire in the hearth while Mike stripped off his wet clothes and draped them over the back of a chair. We ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, the warmth of the fire chasing away the chill in the air. Mike seemed to relax in front of the crackling flames, his guard dropping ever so slightly. I felt a flicker of unease, a voice in the back of my mind warning me to be cautious. After dinner, I showed Mike to the guest room, a small, cozy space with a single bed and a dresser. He thanked me again, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I wished him good night and retreated to my own room, locking the door behind me out of habit. I tried to sleep, the sound of the rain drumming against the cabin roof lulling me into a fitful slumber. But something nagged at me, a sense of unease that refused to fade. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of Mike and the decision I had made to bring him into my home. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a noise, a creaking floorboard outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, the silence broken only by the steady drip of rain outside. I reached for the baseball bat I kept beside my bed, my fingers curling around the smooth wood. With bated breath, I crept out of bed and tiptoed towards the door. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, listening for any sign of movement on the other side. There it was again, a soft, shuffling sound, followed by the creak of a floorboard. My stomach churned with fear as I realized someone was in the hallway outside my room. Panic surged through me, adrenaline flooding my veins as I gripped the bat tighter. I took a deep breath and flung the door open, ready to confront whoever was there. But the hallway was empty, shrouded in darkness. I flicked on the hallway light, casting long shadows against the walls. There was no sign of anyone, no indication that someone had been there at all. I cursed myself for being paranoid, for letting my imagination run wild. Maybe it was just the old cabin settling, the wood expanding and contracting in the humidity. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the cabin, that there was someone else here with me. I crept down the hallway, checking each room carefully, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement outside the guest room door. I froze in place, my heart skipping a beat as I watched the door handle turn slowly. Dread filled me as the door swung open, revealing Mike standing in the doorway. His eyes were wild, a manic glint in them that sent a chill down my spine. He was holding something, a knife, glinting in the dim light from the hallway. Fear gripped me as I realized what was happening, that Mike had never intended to find shelter from the storm. I raised the baseball bat defensively, my hands trembling as I backed away from him. Mike's lips curled into a twisted smile, his voice low and menacing as he taunted me. He accused me of trying to trap him, of luring him into a false sense of security. I tried to reason with him, to calm him down and convince him to put the knife down. But he was beyond reason, consumed by rage and paranoia. He lunged at me suddenly, the knife slashing through the air towards my chest. Instinct took over as I swung the baseball bat, the wood connecting with his arm with a sickening crack. Mike cried out in pain, stumbling backwards and dropping the knife. Adrenaline surged through me as I lunged for the knife, gripping it tightly in my shaking hands. I backed away from Mike, the knife held defensively in front of me. He glared at me with hatred in his eyes, blood trickling down his arm from where I had struck him. He cursed me, promising revenge for what I had done to him. I edged towards the door, my eyes never leaving Mike's as I searched for a way to escape. The hallway stretched out before me, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I knew I had to get out, to find help before it was too late. With one final glance at Mike, I turned and ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly on the wooden floorboards. I reached the front door and flung it open, the rain pouring down outside. I ran through the storm, the cold rain soaking me to the bone as I raced towards my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I unlocked the door. I jumped inside and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind me as I sped away from the cabin. I drove straight to the nearest police station, my heart pounding in my chest as I recounted what had happened. The officers listened intently, their faces grave as they took notes and asked questions. They assured me they would send units to investigate the cabin, to apprehend Mike before he could harm anyone else. I sat in the station, trembling with shock and relief as I waited for news. Hours passed before an officer returned, telling me they had found Mike hiding in the woods near the cabin. He had tried to flee, but they had caught him before he could escape. They arrested Mike on multiple charges, including attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing that he was behind bars where he couldn't hurt anyone else. The officers praised me for my quick thinking and bravery, but all I could think about was how close I had come to losing my life that night. I returned to the cabin the next day with the police, my hands still shaking as I walked through the rooms. They collected evidence, taking photographs and dusting for fingerprints. The cabin felt different now, tainted by the memory of that terrifying night. I sold the cabin soon after, unable to shake the feeling of dread that hung over it like a dark cloud. I tried to move on with my life, to put the nightmare behind me and focus on the future. But the scars from the night would always be with me, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. I've learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that voice inside me that warns of danger. I know now that not everyone is who they seem, that sometimes the greatest threats can come from those we least expect. I arrived at the remote cabin with a sense of anticipation. It was supposed to be a retreat, a chance to clear my mind and recharge. My business partner, Paul, had suggested it, claiming the serene surroundings would be perfect for brainstorming new ideas. But as I stepped out of my car and surveyed the isolated cabin nestled among tall pine trees, a shiver ran down my spine. Paul greeted me with a warm smile, but something in his eyes seemed off, calculating, almost predatory. I brushed it off as fatigue from the long drive and followed him inside. The cabin was cozy, with a rustic charm that initially put me at ease. Paul had already lit a fire in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. As we settled in, Paul suggested we discuss our business plans over dinner. He poured us both glasses of wine, his charm masking a subtle urgency. He kept steering the conversation towards financial matters, our recent transactions, and projections. I sensed an underlying tension beneath his cheerful facade, but I couldn't quite pinpoint its source. After dinner, Paul suggested a walk outside to enjoy the crisp evening air. I agreed, hoping the fresh air would dispel the unease creeping over me. As we strolled along a narrow path through the woods, Paul abruptly stopped and turned to face me. His smile had vanished, replaced by a cold, steely expression. It was then that he revealed his true intentions. Paul accused me of uncovering his embezzlement scheme, claiming I had evidence that could ruin him. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. He had lured me here under false pretenses, intending to silence me permanently. I tried to reason with him, pleading for my life and promising not to expose him. But Paul was relentless, his eyes glittering with a dangerous resolve. He advanced towards me, his voice low and threatening. I knew I had to act quickly if I wanted to survive. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I feigned compliance and edged towards him. In one swift movement, I grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at Paul with all my strength. It connected with his shoulder, sending him staggering backwards with a grunt of pain. Seizing the opportunity, I turned and sprinted back towards the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear Paul cursing behind me, his footsteps echoing through the woods. Fear gave me wings as I pushed myself to run faster, branches whipping at my face and legs. I burst through the cabin door and slammed it shut behind me, frantically searching for a way to secure it. Paul's footsteps grew louder outside, accompanied by his enraged shouts. I found a heavy chair and wedged it under the door handle, praying it would hold long enough for me to find help. My mind raced as I considered my options. The cabin was isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor or town. I didn't have a phone signal, and Paul had likely disabled the landline. My only hope was to find a way to escape and reach safety before he broke in. I hurried to the back of the cabin, scanning the windows for any sign of Paul. The darkness outside was impenetrable, the shadows hiding his movements. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever, that Paul would eventually find a way inside. I spotted an old axe leaning against the wall and grabbed it, my hands trembling as I prepared to defend myself. I listened intently, praying for any sign that Paul had given up his pursuit. But the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breaths. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I waited, my fear mounting with each passing moment. I considered making a run for it through the woods, but the risk of getting lost or injured was too great. I needed to stay calm and wait for an opportunity to escape safely. Hours passed, the cabin enveloped in an eerie stillness. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me, but I dared not let my guard down. Then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard the distant sound of approaching sirens. Relief washed over me as I realized help had finally arrived. I hurried to the window and waved frantically, hoping the rescue team would see me. Moments later, I heard voices outside and the pounding of footsteps on the porch. The door burst open, and I was greeted by the sight of police officers flooding into the cabin. They quickly assessed the situation, their expressions grim as I recounted what had happened. They assured me that Paul had been apprehended, his attempt to evade capture thwarted by the search team. I collapsed into the arms of a female officer, tears streaming down my face as the adrenaline finally began to fade. They escorted me outside to safety, where paramedics tended to the scratches and bruises I had sustained during my ordeal. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and surrounded by concerned faces, I couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. I had been looking forward to this research trip for weeks. It was a chance to delve deep into my studies, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin I had rented was nestled in a secluded part of the forest, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sounds of nature. On the first day, everything seemed perfect. I set up my equipment, organized my notes, and started exploring the area. The tranquility of the forest was exactly what I needed to focus on my research. But as the sun began to set on the second day, things took a dark turn. I was sitting at the small wooden table in the cabin, reviewing my findings, when I heard a vehicle approaching. Curious, I peered through the window and saw a pickup truck pulling up the gravel driveway. A burly man stepped out, wearing worn-out jeans and a plaid shirt. He looked around with a scowl on his face before striding towards the cabin. I opened the door cautiously, unsure of who he was or what he wanted. The man approached me with purpose, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. He accused me of trespassing on his family's private land, claiming that the cabin I was staying in belonged to them. Panic started to rise within me as I realized I might have unknowingly trespassed. I tried to explain that I had rented the cabin through a legitimate service and had no intention of causing any trouble. But the man grew increasingly agitated, his voice rising with each word. He demanded that I leave immediately and threatened to call the authorities if I didn't comply. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, but he seemed beyond reason. He stepped closer, his body tense with anger. I knew I had to tread carefully, as any wrong move could escalate the situation further. I offered to show him the rental agreement on my phone, hoping it would prove that I had rented the cabin legally. But he scoffed and accused me of forging documents. His demeanor was threatening, and I began to fear for my safety. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I backed away slowly, trying to keep a safe distance between us. The man's eyes bored into mine, filled with suspicion and hostility. I could sense that he was on edge, ready to snap at any moment. Suddenly, he lunged towards me, grabbing me by the collar of my shirt. I struggled against his grip, my mind racing for a way to escape. He was much stronger than me, and I knew I couldn't overpower him physically. Desperation set in as I searched for something, anything, that could help me. Then I remembered the emergency whistle I always carried with me on trips like this. With a swift motion, I reached into my pocket and blew the whistle with all my might. The shrill sound pierced the air, echoing through the forest. The man recoiled, caught off guard by the sudden noise. It bought me a precious moment of distraction. I wrenched myself free from his grasp and bolted towards the dense foliage at the edge of the clearing. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I sprinted through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the man cursing behind me, his heavy footsteps echoing through the forest. Fear fueled my adrenaline as I pushed myself to run faster, my lungs burning with exertion. I zigzagged through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The fading light made it difficult to see, but I pressed on, driven by the primal instinct to survive. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. After what felt like an eternity of running, I stumbled upon a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. Without hesitation, I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sound of pursuit grew fainter behind me, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down yet. I kept moving, my senses on high alert for any sign of danger. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs made my heart skip a beat. I had to find help, contact the authorities, and get out of this nightmare. Eventually, I emerged into a clearing where moonlight filtered through the canopy above. My legs were trembling with exhaustion, but I forced myself to keep going. I didn't stop until I reached a main road, where I finally felt a glimmer of hope. I flagged down a passing car and pleaded with the driver for help. They called the police, and soon officers arrived at the scene. I recounted everything that had happened, still shaken from the ordeal. The police assured me they would search for the man and investigate the situation thoroughly. They escorted me to safety and took my statement at the local station. I learned later that the man had a history of confrontations with hikers and campers in the area. He had been arrested for assault and trespassing multiple times before. As I reflected on the terrifying encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. One moment I had been immersed in my research, and the next I was fighting for my life. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk in even the most tranquil of settings. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my friends. We had rented a cozy cabin by the lake to unwind and catch up, away from the stress of city life. The first day was perfect, laughing, chatting, and enjoying the peaceful surroundings. But on the second evening, things took a chilling turn. We were gathered around the fire pit, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows when we heard a loud banging on the cabin door. Startled, we looked at each other in confusion. Who could it be at this hour? I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. Outside stood our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, his face contorted with anger. He had always been a bit grumpy, but we never expected this. I opened the door slightly, hoping to calm him down and explain that we were just here for the weekend. But Mr. Peterson wasn't interested in listening. He launched into a tirade about our noise and presence disturbing his peace, accusing us of ruining his quiet life. I tried to reason with him, apologizing and promising to keep the noise down. But his demeanor grew increasingly hostile, his voice rising with each word. He demanded that we leave immediately or face the consequences. Fear started to creep in as I realized this wasn't just a case of a grumpy neighbor. Mr. Peterson was furious, and his anger seemed to be escalating dangerously. I glanced back at my friends, their faces mirroring my own unease. Before I could say anything else, Mr. Peterson shoved the door open with surprising force, causing me to stumble backward. He barged into the cabin, his eyes blazing with fury. I tried to block his path, but he brushed past me as if I were nothing. He started yelling at my friends, accusing them of being disrespectful and disruptive. They tried to reason with him, but it only seemed to make him angrier. He was like a volcano ready to erupt, and we were caught in the crossfire. Suddenly, Mr. Peterson grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it across the room, narrowly missing one of my friends. The situation had escalated into pure chaos, and panic gripped us all. Realizing that we were in serious danger, I frantically searched for a way to de-escalate the situation. But Mr. Peterson was beyond reason, fueled by his own rage and resentment. In a desperate attempt to protect ourselves, we retreated to the far corner of the cabin, putting as much distance between us and Mr. Peterson as possible. He continued to shout threats and insults, his eyes wild with fury. I knew we couldn't stay trapped in the cabin with him. We had to find a way out, but the thought of confronting him again sent chills down my spine. The cabin suddenly felt like a prison, and Mr. Peterson, our captor. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I scanned the room for anything that could help us. My eyes landed on the window, a small, narrow escape route. It was risky, but it was our only chance. I motioned to my friends to follow me silently. We tiptoed towards the window, careful not to make a sound. Mr. Peterson was still ranting, oblivious to our movements. As quietly as possible, I unlatched the window and pushed it open. The cool night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside. One by one, my friends crawled through the window, their faces pale with fear. I was the last to go through, casting one last glance at Mr. Peterson, who was now pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I prayed he wouldn't notice our escape until we were safely away. Once outside, we ran through the woods, guided only by the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of fear through me, fearing Mr. Peterson might come after us. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where we flagged down a passing car. The driver, startled by our panicked appearance, called the police. We recounted our harrowing ordeal, still shaking with adrenaline and fear. The police arrived quickly and went to the cabin to apprehend Mr. Peterson. They found him still inside, ranting and raving. He was arrested on the spot, charged with assault and trespassing. As we gave our statements at the police station, relief washed over us. We had escaped a potentially deadly situation, thanks to quick thinking and a stroke of luck. But the horror of that night lingered in my mind. Mr. Peterson's rage had been so intense, so uncontrollable. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, even in a seemingly peaceful setting. I couldn't help but think about what could have happened if we hadn't found a way to escape. The thought sent shivers down my spine. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The cabin, once a place of relaxation and joy, now held dark memories. It would be a long time before I could feel safe in such a secluded place again. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a chance to focus on my investigative journalism away from distractions. I rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes and bustling city noise. The cabin was rustic but cozy, nestled among tall pine trees with a serene lake nearby. It seemed like the perfect place to dive into my research on a sensitive story I'd been working on. The first few days were exactly what I needed: quiet, solitude, and the freedom to delve into my notes and interviews without interruptions. The cabin had no internet or cell service, which initially felt liberating as it kept me away from the constant barrage of notifications and emails. But on the fourth day, things took a dark turn. As I sat at the small wooden table, poring over transcripts and trying to piece together the puzzle of my investigation, I heard the crunch of footsteps outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't seen another soul since arriving, and I certainly hadn't expected visitors. Peering cautiously through the window, I saw a man standing outside, staring directly at the cabin. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and piercing eyes that seemed to bore into mine even from a distance. Instinctively, I stepped back from the window, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? How did he find me? I watched as the man circled the cabin, his movements deliberate and purposeful. It was clear he wasn't just out for a stroll in the woods. He knew I was here, and he had come for a reason. Fear tightened its grip on me as I realized the gravity of the situation. My investigation must have hit a nerve, and now someone was trying to silence me. I had to act fast. I grabbed my phone, hoping against hope that I could get a signal. No luck. The cabin remained a dead zone, leaving me completely isolated from the outside world. I considered my options. Confronting the man outside was out of the question. He was clearly not here for a friendly chat. My best bet was to wait and observe, to gather as much information as I could without revealing my presence. Hours passed, the tension thick in the air. The man didn't leave. Instead, he seemed to settle in, making occasional rounds around the cabin as if guarding it. Nightfall descended, casting long shadows through the trees. I huddled in a corner of the cabin, clutching a kitchen knife for reassurance. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sent shivers down my spine. Then, without warning, the man made his move. He approached the cabin door, his footsteps deliberate and purposeful. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't try to break in. But to my horror, that's exactly what he did. With a forceful shove, he pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The man stepped inside, his presence filling the cabin with menace. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and calculating. There was no mistaking his intent. He was here to intimidate me into silence. I backed away slowly, keeping the knife pointed towards him. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. I had to stay calm, to think rationally despite the terror gripping me. "You shouldn't have dug so deep," he said suddenly, his voice low and dangerous. "You've crossed a line." I didn't respond, didn't dare give away any more than I already had. My only chance was to buy time, to wait for an opportunity to escape. He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. I edged towards the window, calculating the distance. If I could just reach it, if I could break free from this cabin, I might have a chance. But the man anticipated my move. With a swift motion, he lunged towards me, knocking the knife from my hand. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. Panic surged through me as he advanced, his hands reaching for my throat. Adrenaline fueled my fight for survival. I kicked and thrashed, desperate to break free from his grip. His fingers tightened around my neck, cutting off my air supply. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I managed to land a blow to his stomach. He grunted in pain, loosening his hold just enough for me to wriggle free. I darted towards the window, ignoring the pain shooting through my body. I crashed through the glass, shards raining down around me. The cold night air filled my lungs as I stumbled onto the ground outside. I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I reached the main road. Barefoot and bleeding, I flagged down a passing car. The driver, alarmed by my appearance, called the police. I collapsed into the back seat, my entire body trembling with shock and exhaustion. The police arrived quickly, and I recounted the terrifying ordeal. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area but found no trace of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. They offered to take me to the hospital, but I refused. All I wanted was to get as far away from the cabin as possible, to put this nightmare behind me. In the days that followed, I lived in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the man to appear again. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching and waiting. But I was determined not to let fear control me. I continued my investigation, more driven than ever to uncover the truth. The experience had shown me just how high the stakes were, how dangerous the pursuit of truth could be. I learned valuable lessons from that night about resilience, about trust, about the lengths people would go to protect their secrets. It was a harrowing experience that would stay with me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface. But I survived. I made it out alive, thanks to quick thinking and sheer determination. And though the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal, I knew I would emerge stronger from this ordeal. As for the man who tried to silence me, I never saw him again. I woke to the sound of my brother shaking me awake. At first, I didn't understand what was happening, the haze of sleep clouding my mind. But then I saw his face, pale and tense, and I knew something was wrong. "Brian, wake up," he whispered urgently. "Look." I followed his gaze, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the curtains. That's when I saw it, the walls of our cabin, covered in graffiti. Disturbing messages scrawled in red paint, dripping down like blood. My heart pounded as I read the words, "You will pay." I felt a chill run down my spine. Who would do this? Why us? We were just here for a weekend getaway, a chance to unwind and enjoy some time together away from the city. My brother was already on his feet, scanning the room for any signs of intrusion. The cabin felt eerily quiet, the only sound our heavy breathing and the rustling of leaves outside. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. I shook my head, still trying to process the surreal scene before me. The night had been quiet, peaceful even, or so I had thought. Now, looking at the vandalism surrounding us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We cautiously checked the rest of the cabin, but there was no one else inside. The front door was locked as we had left it, and there were no signs of forced entry. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here," my brother replied, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the perpetrator to suddenly appear. But as we moved towards the door, we heard a noise from outside, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. We froze, exchanging a glance filled with fear and uncertainty. Peering through the window, we saw a figure standing just beyond the porch, obscured by the early morning mist. It was a man, tall and imposing, his silhouette outlined against the gray sky. My brother grabbed my arm, pulling me back from the window. "We have to hide," he whispered urgently. We retreated to the bedroom, shutting the door quietly behind us. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as we crouched down, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. Footsteps approached the cabin, slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as the handle of the bedroom door rattled. I held my breath, praying that whoever was outside would go away. Seconds stretched into minutes as we waited in terrified silence. Finally, the footsteps receded, fading into the distance until there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. We waited a few more minutes before daring to move. Cautiously, we cracked open the bedroom door and peered outside. The coast seemed clear, but we didn't dare risk it. "We have to go," my brother whispered, his voice urgent. I nodded, my throat dry with fear. Together, we crept towards the back door, moving as silently as possible. Every creak of the floorboards seemed deafening in the stillness of the cabin. Just as we reached the door, it burst open with a force that sent us stumbling backward. A man stood in the doorway, his eyes wild with anger. It was the same man we had seen outside, a stranger, his face contorted with rage. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled, advancing towards us. We backed away, our minds racing with fear and adrenaline. There was nowhere to run, no way to call for help. It was just the three of us, trapped in a deadly game with no rules. My brother lunged forward, tackling the man with all his strength. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, grunting and struggling for control. I looked around frantically, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy lamp sitting on a nearby table. Without hesitation, I grabbed it and swung it towards the man's head. The impact echoed through the cabin, stunning him long enough for my brother to gain the upper hand. With a final shove, he managed to push the man off and scramble to his feet. "Go!" he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the door. We ran out into the cool morning air, our hearts pounding in sync with our footsteps. I glanced back once, seeing the man stagger to his feet inside the cabin. But we didn't stop, didn't look back again until we were miles away, safe from the nightmare that had unfolded. We called the police as soon as we had a signal, reporting what had happened and giving them the location of the cabin. They arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the area, the man was gone. We spent the rest of the day at the police station, giving statements and trying to make sense of the terrifying ordeal. They assured us they would continue to investigate, but there were no guarantees. In the weeks that followed, we struggled to move on from what had happened. The fear lingered, a shadow that followed us wherever we went. We were more cautious now, more aware of the dangers that could lurk behind every corner. But we were alive. We had survived, thanks to quick thinking and sheer luck. And though the memories would haunt us for a long time to come, we were determined not to let fear dictate our lives. The cabin remained a distant memory, a place tainted by violence and fear. We never went back, never wanted to set foot in that secluded spot again. As for the man who had targeted us, we never found out who he was or why he had chosen us. It was a mystery that would remain unsolved, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of even the most idyllic settings. But we were safe now, together, and that was all that mattered. We had faced our worst nightmare and emerged stronger on the other side, bonded by the shared experience of survival. And as time passed, the fear began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to live our lives to the fullest. We had been through hell and back, but we had come out the other side stronger. I woke up to the chilly morning air seeping through the cracks of our cabin. Paul and I had come out here for a weekend getaway, away from the noise of the city. We'd been planning this trip for months, a chance to reconnect and unwind in the quiet of the wilderness. The night before had been tense. Paul and I had argued, the stress of work and life creeping into our conversation. Harsh words were exchanged, and we both went to bed angry. I hoped the morning light would bring a chance to make amends. But when I opened my eyes, Paul was nowhere to be seen. His bed was empty, the sheets rumpled as if he had left in a hurry. A knot formed in my stomach, a mix of worry and guilt. Had he gone for a walk to cool off? Or something worse? I called out for him, my voice echoing through the empty cabin. There was no response. Panic started to rise in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I checked my phone, no messages, no calls from Paul. Where could he have gone? I stepped outside, scanning the area around the cabin. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still. There was no sign of Paul, no footprints in the dew-covered grass. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As I stood there, unsure of what to do next, a chill ran down my spine. I had the distinct feeling of being watched, of ice boring into the back of my skull. I turned around slowly, scanning the tree line for any movement. That's when I saw him, a figure standing among the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It was too far to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Paul? I called out tentatively, hoping against hope that it was him. There was no response, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Fear gripped me like a vice. I had to find Paul, had to make sure he was okay. Ignoring the nagging feeling that I was being watched, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the flickering light of my flashlight. Every sound, branches snapping underfoot, the rustle of leaves sent a shiver down my spine. I called out Paul's name over and over again, my voice growing hoarse with desperation. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as I searched, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was vast, and panic threatened to consume me with every passing minute. Where was he? Why hadn't he answered? Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint cry for help, barely audible over the sounds of the forest. My blood ran cold. It was Paul's voice, weak and distant, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I pushed through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. The cry came again, closer this time. I followed the sound, my mind racing with fear and relief in equal measure. And then I saw him, Paul, lying on the ground among a thicket of bushes. He looked pale and disoriented, his clothes torn and dirty. Relief washed over me as I rushed to his side. "Paul, are you okay?" I asked urgently, kneeling beside him. He blinked up at me, confusion clouding his eyes. "Matt, what happened?" "I don't know," I replied, helping him to sit up. "You disappeared. I've been looking everywhere for you." Paul shook his head, as if trying to clear it. I don't remember. One moment I was here, the next." He trailed off, his brow furrowed in confusion. I looked around nervously, my earlier sense of being watched returning with a vengeance. Whoever or whatever had been out there was still out there, somewhere in the darkness. "We need to go," I said firmly, helping Paul to his feet. "We can figure this out back at the cabin." We stumbled back through the forest, every sound magnified in the eerie silence. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As we reached the cabin, I quickly locked the door behind us. Paul collapsed onto the couch, his breathing ragged. I paced back and forth, my mind racing with unanswered questions. "What happened out there?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. Paul shook his head again, his face pale. "I don't know, Matt. It's like I blacked out or something. I can't remember anything after we argued." I sank down onto the nearest chair, my mind spinning with possibilities. Had someone been watching us? Had they taken Paul? The thought sent a chill down my spine. "We need to call the police," I said decisively, reaching for my phone. But before I could dial, a knock sounded at the door. Paul and I froze, exchanging a look filled with fear and uncertainty. Who could it be? Was it the person who had been watching us? I cautiously approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see a stranger's face staring back at me. Instead, it was our neighbor, a grizzled man named Bill, who owned a cabin a few miles down the road. Relief flooded through me as I opened the door. "Bill, thank God," I exclaimed, stepping aside to let him in. "We need help. Something happened to Paul." Bill's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "I know," he said grimly. "I saw it." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Bill hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. "I've been keeping an eye on you too," he admitted finally. "I saw someone lurking around your cabin last night. I thought it was just some hiker passing through, but..." He trailed off, his expression troubled. "I heard you calling for Paul this morning. When I went to investigate, I found him out there in the woods." I exchanged a look with Paul, the pieces starting to fall into place. Someone had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to call the police," I said urgently, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. It didn't take long for the police to arrive, their presence a comforting relief amidst the chaos. We told them everything about the argument, about Paul's disappearance, about the figure we had seen in the woods. They searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no evidence of foul play. It was as if our ordeal had never happened. As the hours stretched into days, the police continued their investigation. They questioned neighbors, combed through the forest, but they found no trace of the mysterious figure who had watched us. Paul and I returned home, shaken but grateful to be alive. We never found out who had been watching us, or why they had targeted Paul. It remained a mystery, a dark shadow that hung over our memories of that weekend. But we were safe now, together. And as time passed, the fear began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to move on with our lives. We had survived our ordeal in the wilderness, and we would not let it define us. Still, sometimes late at night, I find myself staring out the window, wondering if we are truly alone. Wondering if someone is out there, watching and waiting for their chance to strike again. But for now, we are safe. And that's all that matters.